So as you're conducting your research, remember you're going to be looking for evidence or information to support your claims in your speech. And a good speech has different types of evidence put together. In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of evidence you might use to support your claims, define what each one of those are, and talk about do's and don'ts for using that type of evidence in your speech. So first, let's just talk about what supporting evidence is. It's basically information that you use to support your ideas. It's going to support whatever main point you're trying to make. So if I'm trying to say that tennis is good for your mental health, I'm going to have some type of statement, statistic, testimony from an expert that says it's good for you. There are many different types of supporting material, but today we're going to focus on 4 different types and talk about some of the tips and ways that we can use this material. First are illustration and examples, second, definitions, third, statistics, and fourth, testimony. So first off, you have illustration or examples, and those are just stories that you might tell in your speech or examples that you might give. So you give an instance of something happening or a personal experience. And the great thing about examples and illustrations is they bring immediacy and emotion to your speech. People love to hear stories, and they always like to hear additional examples. So when you tell them something and give them an example, you help them understand it better. And it brings real life to the speech. So you're supporting it beyond just you saying it. You're giving it some more life to your speech. There's 3 types of illustrations and examples that we're going to talk about. First are brief examples, second are extended examples, and third are hypothetical examples. So a brief example is basically a specific case of something that you refer to in passing. So it basically just gives your audience an example of what you're talking about. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we're talking about a speech on school shootings. So I might say something like, there have been many school shootings in the U.S. For example, Columbine High School, Santa Fe High School, and Parkland High School. Those would be 3 brief examples that help illustrate my point and bring specific cases to your memory. See how it gives more life? It's one thing to say school shootings. It's another thing to bring them closer to home, especially when we talk about Santa Fe, which is in our area of the country. The next type of example is the extended example. And this is more of a story or anecdote that's developed at length. So I might start a speech by telling a story about someone. So, for example, if I were going to give a speech on the right to basically have assisted suicide if you're really ill, I might give the story of someone who was ill and wasn't able to end their life with dignity. And that story might take me a minute or so to give, or even 30 seconds to give, but it's going to be more extended than just a short, brief example. The thing about stories is they have to be told and done well. The next type of example is a fictitious example. It's not real, but it could be real. So it's something that could be a reality. So you might ask people to imagine. So imagine you're sitting in class one day and you hear bang, bang, bang. You don't know what to do. What should be your next step? It might be some type of hypothetical example of what could happen. We often use this in persuasive speeches where we get people to imagine what the world would be like with our solution that we're going to recommend. Here's just a few tips for using illustration and examples. First, as always, make it relevant to the audience. Be sure it's appropriate for the audience. Second, especially when you tell a story, make sure you leave out any irrelevant details. For example, if you were part of a school shooting and going to tell a story about it, it doesn't matter whether you were late or early to school unless it's relevant to the story. Use descriptive words. Get in touch with how it felt, how it smelled, how it looked. That really helps the story come to life. Use common, not rare examples, unless you're really talking about something rare. When your example is there, people should feel like it's something that's real for it to support your speech. Personal experience is great. If you have personal stories that support your speech, include them. That's a great way to support your speech. And then if you're going to use a story, you really need to make sure you practice it well, because what you'll find out immediately is when you start telling a story, you put in all those extra details, and they need to be put in a certain order. So always telling a story takes quite a bit of practice. The next type of support is a definition, and that's just explaining exactly what you mean by a word, a phrase, or an idea. There's two different types of definitions that you might use in your speech. The first is a classification, and that's your normal dictionary type definition. So it's the specialized technical definition, and usually you're going to define things that aren't well known in your speech. However, you also might use an operational definition. And if you think back to science class and you have an operational definition for an experiment, it's going to be the same way in your speech. So maybe you're going to use the term in a certain way for the speech that might not be normal, or there might be debate over what the term even means. So you're going to, just for the purposes of your speech, ask your audience to define the term in the way that you're looking at the term. Some tips for using definitions is you don't want to have too many. You don't want your speech to feel like you're reading from the dictionary. You also want to choose the simplest definition possible. You don't want it to be long or complicated, because your audience is going to have trouble following that. And then you want to be sure that whatever definition or term you use, that you use it consistently throughout the speech. One of the best ways to support your speech is with statistical measures, and most speeches are going to have statistics in it. There's some right and wrong ways to use statistics, so we're going to talk about a few of those. The first problem that students have when they use statistics is not understanding what the statistic means. So we're going to go over 3 different types of common statistical measures, and we're going to look at what they mean. So the first statistical measure is the mean, or the average. The mean is the average of all the group. So that means that you add up all the numbers and divide by the total numbers. It's just simply the average. The median is the middlemost number in the group. So if you put all the numbers in order from top to bottom in terms of the highest number to the lowest number, you would look at the middlemost number, and that's what the median is. It's not the average, and it's not the most common number either. It just happens to be the middle number. The final measure that we're going to talk about is the mode, and that's the number that occurs most frequently in the group. So it's just the most. So here are some tips for using statistics. First, you want to use it to quantify or put a number to an idea. So if you're saying homelessness has increased, it tells how much homelessness has increased. It tells how big a problem is or how small a problem is. The one thing about statistics is people can only keep up with so many numbers at a time, so you need to use them sparingly. You don't want to use statistic after statistic. You also want to make sure that they're representative of the audience. So just because 20% of your classroom thinks there's a problem, that doesn't mean it represents the whole entire campus. So you want to make sure that whatever you do is representative of what you're talking about it being. You always want to explain statistics thoroughly. So you give the statistic and then you kind of put it in common language and explain what you think the point of that statistic is. So why are you using the statistic? What difference does it make? So always share the statistic and then make your point about what's important about the statistic. Then if you're comparing dollars over a period of time, so let's say you're talking about a salary in 2000 versus a salary in 2020, and you're comparing those salaries, you have to adjust for the time and change in money. So if you're doing that, you always need to adjust it for the fact that the dollar was worth more in the past than it is today. And then whenever you have complicated numbers with multiple different numbers in them, you can round them off. So if it's 220, you could say it's around 200. Or if it's 1,345,000, then you could say about 1.5 million or 1.3 million. So make those numbers simpler for you to say and also simpler for your audience to hear. And then for sure, use visual aids to show statistical trends. Use graphs. Also, when using visual aids, I want to give you a couple more tips. You can really use visual aids to make your numbers more effective, and I'm going to show you this over the next couple of slides. There are a variety of ways that you can show numbers on your visual aids. One way to do it is to show graphs. Another way is what I have demonstrated here, which is just to put the number that you're going to share to reinforce it in people's mind on the slide. So, for example, this number is from a speech on COVID-19. So, according to the CDC, 1% of the world population that gets COVID-19 will die. So you can see how I'm just reinforcing the number. But when we really think about it, it's hard for us to think about 1% in terms of 1% seems like a really small number, right? 1% of the world population, not that big of a deal. So this is what I mean by sometimes the need to explain your statistics. So let me interpret that in terms of people. That 1% may seem small, but in actuality, it's 7.7 million people in the world. That's a big number. Another common type of support that you'll use in your speech is testimony. And all this is quotations or paraphrases that you use to support your main point. So it's material and information you find in your sources that you bring into your speech and quote. There's two main types of testimony. There's expert testimony that comes from a professional, somebody that's an expert in something. So for example, if we were dealing with a mass shooting, it might be an FBI agent that's knowledgeable about the topic. The other type of testimony is peer testimony, and that's basically people that have firsthand experience or maybe have some insight into the topic because they've experienced it. And we call that peer testimony. And so basically in our example of the mass shooting, the peer type of testimony would be people that were there when the mass shooting happened. The one thing to note is just because somebody's an expert doesn't make them qualified to talk about any topic. So when it comes to mass shootings, the FBI agent's qualified, but the dentist is not really qualified. Even though most of us would see him as an expert, he's just not an expert in mass shootings. When you're presenting testimony to your audience, you might do it through a direct quote. This is just when you quote the information word for word. Remember, you're verbally citing it, so you're going to basically tell us according to whatever, and you give the exact quote. I really like to rely on my visual aids a lot when I'm giving my speech, and this is one way that I handle quotes in my speech. I create a slide that represents my quote. So this is going to be a speech and a quote about Helen Keller, and I'm going to say, basically, a famous quote from Helen Keller says, "The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart." So I've got my quote right there on my slide that helps me move through it during my speech. I love this way of doing quotes because it really does help the audience, but it only works with shorter quotes like this one. Many times we'll find testimony that has great information, but it's not exactly in the format that's the simplest for our audience to hear, or it needs a little massaging to make more sense. So for example, above we have this quote that's the testimony that this individual's found, and basically it has lots of numbers and adds up to numbers that are meaningful to our audience, but it's complicated to say in a speech. And so you can see how in this example what's been done is it's been simplified so that the audience can easily understand the material. So it's basically being paraphrased. It's not the exact original quote, but it is what the quote says. It's reliable to the quote. So in that case, what we would do is paraphrase. And you'll often find in speeches that your quotes are going to be awkward if you put them in exactly and quote the material exactly. So you need to paraphrase the quote. You just make sure you still give credit to the individual that you're quoting the information from. So basically paraphrasing is you're repeating the source's ideas, but you're doing it in your own words. But you do need to make sure that you cite it and do a verbal citation. The biggest thing that you have to be careful of when you're paraphrasing is taking things out of context. So sometimes people will find information and it was presented with one viewpoint and they change it around to make it match their viewpoint. That's not what you're doing when you paraphrase. You've got to stay true to the intent of the author when you paraphrase. So these are some tips for using testimony. Make sure you quote or paraphrase accurately. Make sure you use qualified sources. Make sure that your sources are unbiased. We talked all about that before when we talked about research. And then make sure you identify your sources to your audience. So now that you understand some of the different types of supporting material, let's just talk about a few more things related to them. It's always great when your supporting evidence shows magnitude, like how big a problem is or how small a problem is. So magnitude's one thing that really works when you're using supporting material. Also, proximity makes a difference. So if I can give examples that are closer to home, like if I'm going to talk about transporting illegal aliens or slave trade, if I can talk about what's going on in Houston, it's better than to talk about what's in Los Angeles or even another country. So I want my supporting material to come from places that my audience has actually experienced and knows well. Then the more concrete you can be, the better. So you need to explain terms, theories, and your statistics. Always make sure you're explaining any concept that might not be clear to your audience. Then, one of the big things, variety. Give a story, give some testimony, give statistics. So they all work together to work on different parts of your speech and make it logical, like very evidence-based, but also very emotion and pathos-based. And then you need to suit your audience with your evidence. And what that means is some audiences like more logical information and some like more emotional information. So audiences that are more logic-based, you want statistics and expert testimony. More pathos or emotional-based audiences, you want stories, analogies, and peer testimony.